Night. A garden. Torches. Die. Bive. Die. Torches. A crowd has come armed with swords and clubs to arrest a teacher who has done nothing wrong. And one of his own students does the unthinkable. He draws a blade. It swings through the torchlight, and a servant's ear hits the ground. The man who drew that sword is Peter, and hours earlier, his teacher told him to buy that sword. The same teacher. The same night. One instruction at supper: sell your cloak and buy a sword. And then, before midnight, the moment that sword is drawn, put it back. 2 commands. One teacher. A few hours apart, and the question that has confused readers of the Gospels for 2,000 years is sitting right there in the dark between them. Did Jesus change his mind? That is what we are going to walk through today. Not with a shrug, and not with a clever dodge, but by going back to the room where it started, the garden where it happened, and the one sentence Jesus said at the table that most people skim right past. Because once you see that sentence, everything else clicks into place. The table, the garden, the blade, the ear, the sheathed sword, and finally, the 2 crosses at the end of the story. It all holds together. Let us start at the beginning. To understand what happens in that garden, you need to know what Jesus had been doing with these men for years. When he first sent them out to preach, the instructions were almost comically specific. Take nothing for the journey. No staff, no bag, no bread, no money, and do not even take an extra tunic. That is Luke chapter 9, verse 3. He sent 70 more out with the same kind of instruction in Luke chapter 10, verse 4. Carry no purse, no wallet, no sandals. Think about what that means for a second. These were men walking into hostile territory with empty hands on purpose. No provisions, no protection, no backup. And here is the detail that makes it matter. They came back. They lacked nothing. Years later, sitting at the table on the night before he died, Jesus reminds them of exactly that. Luke chapter 22, verse 35. He said to them, "When I sent you out without purse, and wallet, and shoes, did you lack anything?" And they said, "Nothing." An entire season of ministry on 0 supplies, and they did not go hungry. They were not robbed. They were not left stranded. The mission worked. So when the instruction suddenly changes, you have to pay attention. Because it does not change for no reason. And change it does. Jesus has been speaking about betrayal, about his body and his blood, about the covenant, and then he turns to practical matters, and what he says sounds like a complete reversal. Luke chapter 22, verse 36. But now, whoever has a purse, let him take it, and likewise a wallet. Whoever has none, let him sell his cloak and buy a sword. Sell your cloak, the outer garment that kept you warm at night. Sell it, and buy a sword. This is the man who told them to take nothing. This is the man who said, "Do not even carry a staff." And now he is telling grown men to sell their coats for weapons. It is the kind of moment that makes you check whether you read the page. Right. And the disciples apparently had the same reaction, because before the sentence is even finished, Jesus gives them the reason. And it is not what anyone expected. He does not say the roads are dangerous. He does not say Rome is getting aggressive. He quotes the prophet Isaiah, chapter 53, verse 12. He was counted with transgressors. And then he says, Luke chapter 22, verse 37, "For I tell you that this which is written must still be fulfilled in me." Let that sit for a moment. Jesus is connecting a purchase order to a prophecy. Sell your cloak, buy a sword, because something written hundreds of years before was about to come true. He was counted with transgressors, numbered with the lawless. Now here is where the story does something strange. The disciples look around the table, and they say, "Lord, behold, here are 2 swords." Luke chapter 22, verse 30t. Verse 38. Think about what they are holding up. 2 swords, for a group of men about to face armed soldiers, temple guards, and the full machinery of Rome. 2 swords is not a defense. 2 swords is a misunderstanding. And Jesus looks at the 2 blades on the table and says, "That is enough." Now, before we move to the garden, we need to be honest about something. That phrase, "that is enough," is genuinely debated. There is no single reading the text settles beyond doubt. Some scholars take it literally. Jesus means the 2 swords are sufficient, and he is truly telling them to arm themselves. Others read it as a dismissal. Enough of this conversation, because they have missed his point entirely. And others hear irony in it. 2 swords against an empire, and that is all you understood. 3 readings, 3 different pictures of what is happening at that table. And the honest answer is that the text does not tell us which one is right. We do not know, but here is what the text does show us, and it is worth slowing down for. The disciples understood nothing of what he meant, because watch what they do with those swords. They do not ask another question. They do not press him. They let the words sit, and then the evening moves on, and the 2 blades go with them, out of the upper room, down the stone stairs, through the narrow streets, and out the city gate, across the Kidron Valley, and up into the olive groves. It is a walk they have made many times, and there has never been anything unusual about it. But tonight, something is different. Tonight, those 2 blades swing at their hips, and every step makes the question louder. What did he mean? They do not know. They do not ask. And that is the tragedy of it. The answer is walking beside them, and they cannot hear it. So keep that phrase in your memory. 2 swords on a table, that is enough. We are coming back to it. Now the story moves to a garden. Gethsemane, a place Jesus knew, because he had gone there with his disciples many times. And it is night. The Last Supper is over. The singing is done. And Jesus has done something he has never done in front of them before. He has prayed. He has prayed so hard that the gospel records his sweat falling like drops of blood. He has already said in Matthew chapter 26, verse 39, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass away from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." That is the context you have to hold. The cup. He asked if it could pass. And then he submitted. And while he is still speaking, Judas arrives. Judas, who left the table earlier. Judas, who knows the garden. Judas, leading a crowd sent from the chief priests and the elders, carrying swords and clubs, carrying lanterns and torches, because they have come hunting a man in the dark. And here is the detail that makes their timing strange. Jesus had been in the temple every day that week, teaching in broad daylight in front of the crowds. Luke chapter 22, verse 53 records his own words about it. "When I was with you in the temple daily, you did not stretch out your hands against me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness." They never dared to take him in the day, because the people were on his side. So they came at night instead. They came when the streets were empty and the crowds were asleep. And the signal Judas has agreed on is one of the most devastating details in the entire Gospels. Matthew chapter 26, verse 48. "Now he who betrayed him gave them a sign, saying, 'Whoever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him.' Not a shout, not a finger pointed. A kiss, the gesture of love, used as the instrument of betrayal. Judas walks up to Jesus and calls him teacher and kisses him. That is Matthew chapter 26, verse 49, and the crowd surges forward. This is it, the moment everything has been building toward, and the disciples who hours ago showed Jesus their 2 swords now know what those swords were for, or at least they think they do. Here is where the gospel accounts give us something precious, because they are not identical. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell us that someone drew a sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear, but only John's gospel names him. John chapter 18, verse 10. Simon Peter, therefore, having a sword, drew it, and struck the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So it is Peter, the man who told Jesus at supper that he would never leave him, even if everyone else did. The man who promised, in Matthew chapter 26, verse 33, "Even if all are made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble." And now, in the torchlight, that same man has done the one thing Jesus told him to do hours earlier. He has used the sword. He has bought it. He has carried it. He has drawn it. And he has taken a swing at the face of a servant. Think about what is moving through him in that moment. Finally, something he can do. Finally, a way to be useful. The teacher says, "Buy a sword," so he bought it. The teacher says, The hour is coming. So here it is. Every instinct in Peter screams that this is the moment he proves his loyalty, and his reward is one severed ear and a servant bleeding in the dirt. That is what happens when we take a word from the teacher and run it through our own fear. And now watch what Jesus does. Because this is the heart of the whole scene. Matthew chapter 26, verse 52. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place. For all who take the sword will die by the sword. Put it back." The blade that Jesus told him to buy. The blade Peter just used in what he thought was defense of his teacher. Put it back. And here is the thing most people never realize. The contradiction is not something we have to smooth over. It is the point. The command at the table and the command in the garden are not two different teachers. They are the same teacher doing two different things. The instruction to buy the sword was never a license to swing it. And the moment it became one, Jesus closed it. Not because he changed his mind, because the sword was never the weapon. But then Jesus does not stop with a rebuke, because a rebuke alone would leave the disciples still confused. So he shows them what he is doing. And what he says next is one of the most astonishing statements in the whole arrest scene. Matthew chapter 26, verse 53. Or do you think that I could not ask my Father, and he would even now send me more than 12 legions of angels? Let the scale of that sink in. A Roman legion was roughly 6,000 soldiers. Jesus says more than 12 legions of angels, more than 72,000. He is not outnumbered in that garden. He is not trapped. He is not a victim who got caught. He is a king with an army standing by, an army he does not call. And then he asks the question that turns the entire arrest inside out. Verse 54. How then would the scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so? The arrest is not a failure of the plan. The arrest is the plan. Jesus did not lose control in that garden. He held it. He held it so tightly that he could have ended the scene with a word, and instead, he let them take him. Because the scriptures had to be fulfilled. And the scriptures he means point straight back to the scroll he quoted at supper. The one about being counted with the transgressors. It is all one thread. Sell your cloak, buy a sword, be counted with the lawless. Let yourself be arrested. We are watching the thread being pulled through the story, and it is not finished yet. But there is one more detail in this garden that almost never makes it into the retelling, and it is the detail that changes the whole temperature of the scene. Only Luke records it. Luke chapter 22, verse 51. And it is almost impossible to read without stopping. The servant is bleeding on the ground. His ear is lying in the dirt. The man who cut him is standing there with a sword in his hand, just told to put it away. And Jesus, the man being arrested, the man with 72,000 angels on standby, does not defend himself, does not explain himself, does not even finish his sentence to Peter. He reaches down, he touches the man who came to arrest him, and he heals him. The gospel does not give us the words Jesus spoke there, and we should not invent them. It simply tells us what happened. Jesus touched the ear and healed him. Think about who that man is. He is not a friend. He is not a bystander. He is part of the mob that came to drag Jesus away in the night. He works for the people who have already decided to kill Jesus, and Jesus heals him. This is the kingdom, standing in the middle of an armed crowd, with a sword at his feet and blood on the ground, and responding to violence with grace. That is, the whole lesson of the garden in one gesture. And it is why the next thing Jesus says matters so much, because the disciples still have their hands on their swords, and they still do not understand. So Jesus speaks to Peter, and his words close the circle. John chapter 18, verse 11. Put the sword into its sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not surely drink it? The cup. That is the word he used in the garden when he prayed. Let this cup pass from me. And now he answers his own prayer. No, I will drink it. The cup is not a sword. It is not a fight. It is not a political victory. The cup is the cross. And everything Peter did with the sword was an attempt to refuse the cup. Every swing of that blade was a way of saying, not this. There has to be another way. We can win this now. But Jesus had already decided the only way the kingdom is won is by drinking the cup. And now the arrest happens. The soldiers take him. The disciples stand frozen in the dark, watching. And here is something the Gospels place right in the middle of this moment that most readers pass over. Jesus had already told them this would happen, not in a parable, in plain words. Matthew chapter 26, verse 31. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. He had quoted the prophet Zechariah chapter 13, verse 7, and he had quoted it to them. The shepherd would be struck, the sheep would scatter. He warned them, in advance, that the night would end this way, and still they stood there. And still it happened. Because being told a thing is coming is not the same as understanding it. The disciples had heard the prophecy with their ears and carried 2 swords out the door, and neither one saved them from the moment the shepherd was struck. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. In the very next verses, every single disciple does exactly what the prophecy said they would do. Matthew chapter 26, verse 56. Then all the disciples left him and fled, all of them. The sheep scattered exactly as the scripture said. And the man who swung the sword? The man who was ready to fight to the death for his teacher? Matthew chapter 26, verse 34 records Jesus telling him, Most certainly I tell you that tonight, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And that is exactly what happens. Peter follows at a distance. He sits in the courtyard by a fire. 3 times, people recognize him. 3 times he says he does not know the man. Matthew chapter 26, verses 69 through 75, and on the 3rd denial, the rooster crows. And the gospel says, Peter remembered the word of Jesus, and he went out and wept bitterly, the armed disciple. The one who drew the sword, the one who thought he understood what the teacher meant. He is the one weeping in the dark, while the teacher he loves is being led away. Think about the distance he traveled in a single night. At supper, he was ready to die for Jesus. In the garden, he was ready to kill for Jesus. And by the courtyard, he would not even say he knew him. The sword did not make him brave. It made him think he was. And when the sword was gone, so was the courage. If you have ever reached for your own sword and watched it fail, you know exactly how that courtyard felt. So now the story moves from the garden to a throne room. And this is where the reason for the sheathed sword finally gets spoken out loud. Jesus has been dragged before the Roman governor, Pilate. And Pilate is genuinely confused. Here is a man with no army, no weapons, no followers who stayed to fight. And yet Pilate has been told this man is a king. So he asks Jesus directly, Are you a king? And Jesus answers in John chapter 18, verse 36, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would fight, that I would not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. There it is. The explanation of everything that happened in the garden, stated in one sentence. My servants would fight. If my kingdom were of this world, they would fight. That is what Peter tried to do. Peter tried to make the kingdom of this world work, with this world's tools, by this world's rules. And Jesus is saying, That is not how my kingdom works. It is not built with blades. It is not defended with legions. It is not won by refusing the cup. My kingdom is won the way a servant wins. By drinking it, by surrendering, by grace that heals the man who came to arrest you. Everything in that garden was Jesus showing his disciples, in the most vivid way possible, what his kingdom actually looks like, because they had spent 3 years hearing him teach it. And they still reached for a sword. And now we come to the place where the whole thread closes, because Jesus said at the table that he had to be counted with the transgressors. And the gospel records in Luke chapter 23, verse 33, that when they came to the place that is called the skull, they crucified him there with the criminals, one on the right and the other on the left. And Matthew chapter 27, verse 38. Then 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on his right hand and one on the left, 2 criminals, one on either side, Jesus in the middle, hanging between lawbreakers, counted with the transgressors. The prophecy he quoted at supper, with the swords on the table, has now come true in the most literal way imaginable. He was numbered with the lawless. And here is where the phrase from the table finally finds its answer. 2 swords. That is enough. It was never enough to fight. 2 blades could not stop a mob, could not move an empire, could not save him from the cup. But it was enough for the point. It was enough to bring the swords to the garden. It was enough to give Peter the chance to swing one. It was enough to show the whole world the difference between a kingdom of force and a kingdom of grace. The two swords were never enough to win the fight. They were exactly enough to make the point. And the point was that the king of a kingdom not of this world would not fight like one of this world's kings. He would let them take him. He would heal the man who came to get him. And he would hang between two criminals, exactly where the prophecy said he would be. So let us take a breath and look at where we have been. One night. Two commands. At the table, Jesus said, "Sell your cloak and buy a sword." In the garden, he said, "Put it away." And for 2,000 years, readers have asked which one he meant. The answer the Gospels give is that he meant both, and they were never in conflict. The command to buy the sword was about fulfilling the scripture. The command to put it away was about showing what the kingdom is. One set the stage, the other revealed the king. And the difference between the two is the difference between Peter's fear and Jesus' trust. Peter looked at the night and saw a fight to win. Jesus looked at the same night and saw a cup to drink. Peter reached for a blade. Jesus reached for a servant's ear. Peter tried to keep Jesus from the cross. Jesus walked straight into it. And here is the thing, worth sitting with. The same Peter who drew the sword is the same Peter who denied Jesus 3 times. And that is not where his story ends. The Gospels record that after the resurrection, Jesus found Peter and asked him, 3 times, "Do you love me?" 3 denials, 3 questions, 1 restoration. The man who tried to fight his way out of the plan was not discarded because of it. He was met with the same grace Jesus showed in the garden. He was called again not to carry a sword, but to feed the sheep. The man who scattered with the rest of them was given the flock to care for. That is the God we are dealing with. He does not need your sword. He does not want your sword. And he will love you anyway when you reach for it. And maybe that is the question this story is asking you tonight. What is the sword in your hand? Not a literal blade. The thing you reach for when the plan looks like it is falling apart. The force you use to make things happen the way you think they should. The argument you win, the control you hold. The exit you take. You know the feeling. A door closes and you force it. A relationship fractures and you fight to win. A season goes dark and you grab for whatever weapon you can find. Because sitting still feels like losing. And before you leave this story thinking it settles a modern debate about weapons, hear what it does and does not say. The text is not answering the question of whether a Christian may defend their family or their home. People have wrestled with that question for centuries. And this passage is not the place that settles it. What this passage is answering is a different question entirely. What builds the kingdom of God? What advances the work he is doing? And to that question, the answer is unmistakable. Not the blade, not the force, because the whole time, Jesus is standing in the garden, saying, "Put it back. The kingdom does not advance by your sword. It advances the way it always has, by surrender, by trust, by a hand open to the man who came to arrest you, by a cup accepted when you asked for it to pass. Your sword will not fail because you are not strong enough. It will fail because it was never the instrument. It was never the point. The instrument is the open hand. The point is the cup. So where did the sword end up? It ended up in the dirt, where Peter let it fall. It ended up on the ground of the garden, next to the ear that had been healed, and the man who walked away whole, because the teacher reached down and touched him. The blade did not save anyone. It did not rescue the king. It did not stop the cup. But the healed servant walked out of that garden with an ear that worked. And Peter walked out with nothing but the memory of what he had done. And the God who healed the ear of the man who came to get him is the same God who will meet you in your darkest garden and ask you to trust him with what happens next. 2 swords on a table, 1 blade in the dirt, a healed ear, a rooster, a man weeping, a shepherd struck, and the sheep scattered, and then gathered again by the same hand, and a king who could have called 12 legions and did not, because the kingdom is not of this world. And the cup he was given, he chose to drink. That is what he did in the garden, and the question of which command he meant was never really about the sword at all. It was about whether we will trust him enough to put it down,